Hey everyone, I'm Kurt Hammerly of Hammerly Ceramics, and today I'm going to show you guys how I make this bark texture. I'm sure many of you are pretty familiar with how people make surface textures with sodium silicate. You brush it on, you blowtorch it, and then you expand the clay and you get a crackly texture on the outside. I take this a step further and mix the sodium silicate into thick slip. And then when I apply the blowtorch and expand the forms, I get this thick, rough bark texture. So today we're going to talk about the materials needed to do this, the technique behind making the slip and getting it ready to apply, and then show you some different variations on the texture that I use. And here we go. So I have in front of me all the materials and tools that you're going to need in addition to normal throwing tools for this technique. First of all, I have a very thick slip that I make from the trimmings of my own clay. I use a clay called Black Mountain from Aardvark, but pretty much this could work with any clay that you use. So the easiest way for me to make the slip is from reconstituted trimmings that I would normally just recycle back into throwable clay. However, I use it for this technique. You could also take clay right out of the bag, saturate it with water, mix it up, and get this kind of thick slip that you're going to start with. The next thing that you're going to need is, of course, sodium silicate. We're going to mix this into the slip, and then it is going to thicken it up, but it's also going to give it a property where when you apply the blowtorch, it shrinks more than normal clay would, which gives it more of a crackly, rough surface texture. Along with that, I have a bottle of water to just spray in case there's not enough water here. That helps a lot. A power drill with a mixer really helps. I'm not sure if you could do this as well by hand. It would be really exhausting. From there, I have a propane torch and a MAPP gas torch. You can do this with a propane torch, but it has about a third of the BTUs of the MAPP gas torch. The MAPP gas torch does it better for me, but not everyone has these laying around. The biggest question I get is, can you do this with a heat gun? And unfortunately, the answer is no, not really. It's not the same. The goal here is to get the surface of this slip as crispy and as dry and hot as possible while still keeping the clay on the inside of the form malleable and cool. And we'll talk more about that later, but just know that you need as much BTUs as possible to do that. And that's about all you need for this, of course, beyond your normal throwing tools. Let's show you how I mix up the slip and get it ready for application. All right, so now we're going to mix the slip up with the sodium silicate to get it thick and ready for application. You may notice that I have a different drill than the last scene, and that is because my cordless drill doesn't want to cooperate today. I think the batteries are going bad. So I have a corded drill with my mixer on the end. I have my thick slip, I have my sodium silicate, and I have my spray bottle. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a little well in the middle. I'm going to spray some water in there just to get this going. It helps mix in the sodium silicate better. And then I'm going to open up the sodium silicate and I'm going to pour about a teaspoon in. This is a tricky part because I can't really measure out exactly how much is needed. Based on how dry or wet the slip is, and based on what kind of texture I'm going for, it may take more, it may take less, and we really won't know until we start mixing it. What I'm really looking for here is a certain consistency, not necessarily perfect measurements. So I added some water, I poured in the sodium silicate, so now we're going to mix this up. I normally do this in a different bucket so it doesn't move around quite so much, but for the filming, it was necessary to use a little bit of a different bucket. So bear with me here. All right, so my slip today is a lot drier than I normally use it. It's been sitting in the bucket for a while and it's had a chance to kind of even out and dry a little bit, so it's pretty thick already. So I don't think I'm actually going to need to add any more sodium silicate to it. If you'll notice that this is very spreadable. It's a little bit thicker than peanut butter, but you're looking for something that is spreadable so you can keep it thick, but not so thick that when you paint it onto the outside surface that we're going to do when we start working with clay, if you paint it on and it's too thick, it's going to deform the clay as you go. So really this is what you're looking for. You're looking for it to be sticky and you're looking for it to be thick so you can get a thick application, but you're not looking for it to be so thick that it's difficult to paint on. And I think that painting it on the outside of the bucket like this really shows that well, hopefully. All right, so now we can get into the actual throwing. All right, so before we move on, I want to talk one more second about this slip. This is going to be probably the part of the process that requires the most practice and the most experimentation. If your slip is too wet and you add the sodium silicate, it's going to get super thin, and then what you can do is you can keep adding more and more sodium silicate until it thickens up. Sodium silicate is a deflocculant. They add it to casting slip to thin it out while keeping the specific gravity high so that it works better for casting. But when you put enough in, it has the opposite effect, and it takes this runny, thin, slip-like material and it starts thickening it up like a gel again. I recommend starting with the driest slip you can that's still like peanut butter thickness, so you don't have to add a lot of sodium silicate. And just know that if you end up with really runny, thin slip, you either need to start with thicker slip or you need to add more sodium silicate and mix it up thoroughly until it gels. All right, so for the next part, we are going to need our blowtorch, our slip that we just mixed up, and then I just wedged some clay, and we are going to get started here. So the first thing I think a lot of you might notice is that I do throw left-handed. Just figured I might as well say that now. The first thing we're going to make here is just a simple planter, just a cylinder with the surface texture. And my wheel is going the wrong way. I also throw standing, in case anybody was wondering about that. It was something that was recommended to me a few years ago when I got my own wheel by an older potter. Said that it would save my back in the long run, so I decided to give it a shot, and I really like it. It took a bit of time to get used to, but it's really not bad once you get used to it. All right, so for this first one, I really am not worried about, for this first one, I'm really not worried about getting it to a certain size. I'm not worried about weighing my clay. We are just going to talk about getting the technique to work today. I did not wedge my clay very nicely. All right, here we go. I'm going to leave this with a pretty thick bottom so that I can trim a nice foot into it so it will be a succulent planter. One point that I want to make here is that this is a difficult technique to do with very dainty pots. As I throw this cylinder, I need to remember that I'm going to be slapping this thick slip on the outside, and it kind of needs to have some thickness to it, not only to hold up to that application process, but it also needs to have some thickness to it so that when you blowtorch it, you can blow, it has enough thermal mass in the walls of the clay that you can blowtorch it enough, the outside gets crispy and the inside still stays soft. All right, now what I'm doing is I'm smoothing the outside surface a little bit. But the other thing that I'm doing is I'm getting as much water off of the surface as possible because I really want that slip to stick. I'm going to flare out the top a little bit because this process has a tendency to make the tops of your pots crack. So you want to be expanding those as little as possible after everything's been blowtorched. So making this kind of flared shape with a taper in the middle allows you to get a really dramatic crackle effect in the middle while also not letting your pot crack on the top. Because unless that's something you're going for, I personally don't like big cracks at the top of my planters because it lets soil and water leak out fairly easily. Wash my hands real quick before I grab the blowtorch. All right, so I'm going to blowtorch it a little bit before the application of this slip, and this is just going to firm up those walls a little bit so that they don't collapse under the pressure from that slip, and that's so it sticks a little better. I can feel that the surface is a little dry to the touch and hot once I've torched it enough. How long you do this is probably the other big question that I get about this process, and that's another difficult one to answer because it's different with every single pot. The amount of clay you have and the circumference and height of your pot is going to play into how long it needs to be blowtorched, as well as what kind of blowtorch you actually have. I got the MAPP gas torch because it makes it go a little bit faster, but the blowtorch will work too, it just takes a little longer. All right, so now we have our cylinder thrown. I have the surface torched a little bit just to make it a little dry and make it a little sturdier. So now I am going to use this knife. You could use any tool that you like. You can use your fingers. And I'm going to start scraping off some of that thick slip and just start applying it to the surface and just painting it on there in a somewhat thick but hopefully as even as you can coat to allow for there not to be any super dry spots and also any spots that haven't been blowtorched enough. So you're looking for an even layer of that slip all over the entire outside surface. This is probably the most tedious part of the process, but this is how I get it on. All right, now once you have the slip applied to the entire outside surface in a somewhat even coat, here was the big difference when I finally made the bark texture. This was by complete accident that it ended up happening, but the way that your final texture is formed depends on how this texture before you torch it looks like. So what I realized for the bark texture is you're looking for these vertical cracks that spread apart and it looks like the bark of a tree. And like I said, this was totally by accident, but I took this knife and another tool and I just started painting up. So you can see that there are those vertical lines, and those vertical lines are going to dictate where the cracks form. You don't want them to be perfectly even because then it will look too planned. So you want some spontaneity in there. Some horizontal lines also give it more interest. So I just sit here like this and I create that upfront texture. So here's what it looks like before. All right, so the next step is we're going to blowtorch this outside until it gets nice and crispy, and then we'll expand it from there. So here we go. You get the wheel going fairly quick, because if the heat gets onto one spot for too long, it starts to heat through the walls, and that's what will make your end result crack on you. All right, that looks good for this first one. Again, the time that you actually blowtorch it is going to be something that you're going to have to practice because it depends on too many factors for me to explain like an actual time for you. All right, you can tell that it's ready when you see this outside surface is starting to get some dry spots and it's actually starting to crack in between those vertical lines that you created. So the next step is I'm going to take a sponge and I'm going to get it pretty wet because the inside of this is started to dry out and it's a little warm. So I'm going to run a lot of water with that sponge over that inside surface just to re-wet it, because now we're going to open the form and we're going to create that bark texture, that final bark texture. All right, so here the key is you can't exactly touch the outside and expand it the normal way. So you're going to take one hand on the inside. I do it with my hands on the inside to open. Again, I throw left-handed, so this will look a little different for you. I am going to put my elbow on the splash tray here. I'm going to grab my first hand with my second just to stabilize it so I can pull out evenly. And then get the wheel going and start to expand in slow pulls up. And it's a little bumpy because there are parts that are a little drier and crispier than the rest. It's hard to get this exactly a perfect cylinder. And also, if you go slow enough, you'll be able to feel when the clay starts to crack. And that's a hard thing to explain, but as the wheel goes round and round, I can start to feel cracks forming in the clay under the surface. And through practice, you'll just know how far you can push this before it starts to break through. All right, so let's see how we did. All right, I like that. That makes me very happy. So you'll notice that now we have these outside smooth parts that were dried by the torch, and then those outside kind of plates separated as we opened the clay, and that's what led to these rough crevices. And you can see that they're pretty random because of the way that I applied that initial surface. So yes, I'm very happy with that. It looks good. I will, hold on. All right, so I personally like to cut a little bit off the top of here. I use an X-Acto knife. You could use a pin tool, but I'm gonna get it going and I'm gonna balance my hands here and I'm just going to slice a little top off here. And there we go. We got that a little bit nicer on the top. And squeeze out this sponge. Because we applied so much water before we blow, or after we blow torched it, there is quite a bit of water in the bottom of this pot. So I'm gonna get that out of there. Keep compressing the bottom, just like you would on a normal piece. Smooth this inside out a little bit because it is a little bumpy. Smooth out the rim here. And there we go. And we'll cut this off and we'll go again. So I'm going to show you a couple different sizes and a couple different surface textures. Those videos will probably predominantly be sped up. And this one will hopefully be pretty much full. I may have sped up some of the more boring parts, but that's the whole process. All right, so here we go for pot number 2 with my bark texture technique. For this one, we're gonna do a little bit of a different surface finish on the slip before we blowtorch it to try to get a pretty significantly different final texture. So let's see how we can do with this. I'm gonna color in this one a little bit in the middle, just to allow a little bit more room to expand it after it's torched, so we can get more of a straight-sided vertical form when we're finished. So to start, I'm going to apply the slip very much the same way that I did with the first one. But it's the surface texture that we're going to create right before blow torching it the second time that is going to change that final texture. So still again, with this knife, I'm going to paint up the sides and try to get as even of a layer as possible. All right, so how I want to apply the surface texture on the outside of this one is just going to be with my fingers, and I'm just going to smooth out the outside of this in horizontal rings and just smooth that clay out so there's still a as even as possible layer on the outside, but the actual surface texture is going to be very different than the last one. All right. See how that's a little different? Instead of those vertical lines coming up the sides with these clear lines and clear cuts, we made it a little bit smoother than last time, and it has more horizontal lines in it than last time. All right, you can see that it's steaming and that the surface texture is pretty firm. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did last time. I'm going to saturate my sponge with water, and I'm going to run it up and down the inside just to get that smooth. I have a feeling that this one might crack. I think that the walls were a little thin and I blowtorched it pretty hard, but we'll see what we can do with it. I can feel it cracking about halfway down. So let me just smooth it out just a tiny bit, and we'll call it good. There we go. So that's not too bad. Let me get the water out of the inside and cut the top off a little bit, and then we'll look at this texture. Here we go. All right, so you'll notice just by looking at this surface that it's a little bit different. We still have some long vertical cracks, but we have a lot more straight horizontal cracking than the last one. This is one that I personally don't like as much, but I really just wanted to get it across that depending on how you approach the surface texture before you blowtorch it, the cracks are going to form differently and you can get a lot of variety out of this. I really think there's a lot of potential that I haven't explored at all with this surface texture and with this technique. So I'd really be interested to see what other people come up with. I think we're gonna go forward. I'm gonna do a couple more. No, I know what we're gonna do. We're gonna do one more, this same format, and I'm really gonna glob on the slip and we're gonna blowtorch the heck out of it and we're gonna see something really crazy that you can do with this technique. All right, so here we are with the third pot that I'm gonna do here. This one is gonna be an interesting one. We're gonna see a little bit how far we can take this technique. It should be fun. I've done this once or twice before and it led to some pretty interesting results for really, really heavily rough textured succulent cactus planters. But let's see what we can come up with. All right, that looks good. We have nice colored in middle, open top, open bottom, so we can really get a lot of slip onto there and then open it up and get a pretty dramatic texture. Again, I'm going to blowtorch the outside before I apply the slip just so we can get it to adhere a little bit better and get those walls to be a little stronger. All right, here we go. We're going to apply, we're going to get a lot of slip on that outside surface. I'm going to press it on pretty well still. You'll see me just pushing it on there. I'm trying to eliminate air bubbles. If you get a big air bubble under the slip, you can get some weird heat transfer, weird cracking issues. So I'm going to try to avoid that if at all possible by pressing the slip on kind of across the surface like this. Get that on there nice and thick. This one could be pretty exciting. So as for a surface texture on this one before we blowtorch, I'm going to do one fairly similar to the first bark. It's usually the one that I like the resulting texture of the most. Again, I think that this technique has a lot of possibilities and I'd be really interested to see where people take it. So please, if you do try this and you get some interesting results, find me on Instagram at Hammerly Ceramics, or you can just email me at hammerlyceramics@gmail.com. I would love to see what you all come up with. All right, so let's go get a couple horizontal ones here. All right, so that's what I'm going with. So now we will just blowtorch it pretty heavily because we have that extra layer of slip on the outside. It's a thicker layer than the last ones. It should be able to handle a lot more heat before cracking all the way through. So we really want to get it really crispy on the outside. All right, here we go. It is quite crispy on the outside, still soft and a little bit cool on the inside. All right, so here we go. It is crispy and firm on the outside and still just warm and soft inside that cylinder there. So now I'm gonna soak my sponge. I'm gonna wet the inside. And again, I'm gonna grab with my right hand and pull with my left a little bit. And I'm gonna open this as quickly as I can to try to get some dramatic cracks in there. And let's see what we got. I like that one a lot. I like this one a lot. That is a pretty dramatic texture on the surface there. That might have been one of a favorite that I've ever done. Just get that extra water out. That is a rough surface texture. Yeah, I really like that one a lot. All right, so that is how I make my surface texture look like bark using slip and sodium silicate and a blowtorch. I think I'll finish this video off by showing some more close-up shots of some different textures that I can create. And then I really hope this was helpful. And I hope I touched on everything and answered every question that you all have. So thanks for watching. Again, I'm Kurt from Hammerly Ceramics, and have a good day.